Animal history is relatively new and emerging field of study that examines the role of animals in human history. It is an interdisciplinary field that draws on a variety of sources, including archaeological studies, historical documents, and literary works. Animal history seeks to understand how animals have influenced human societies and how humans have, in turn, affected animals. It becomes interesting and also essential to dig deeper on the issue as animals have been a creature close to humans either as a symbol for religious and cultural things or as a source of food, transportation, and labor. Many have also argued that the relationship between humans, and animals are dynamic and change over time. Understanding these changes can help us to better understand our own history and our relationship with the natural world. To know more on the issue, we have invited two experts on the subject. Please give a warm welcome to our speakers, Mr. Timothy P. Barnard, Associate Professor from the Department of History, National University of Singapore, and Mr. Ruizhi Choo, PhD student from the Department of History, the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I hope I pronounced your name right. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our speakers for taking the time to be with us today. I know they have a lot of knowledge to share, and I'm sure we are all eager to learn from them. For today's agenda, after I finish with the introduction, we're going to have an opening remark from Mr. Safar Ahmed, and we will proceed with the presentation session from the speakers and have the question and answer session afterward. For those who have comments or want to raise a question to the speakers, feel free to use the raise hand feature during the Q&A session, and you may deliver your questions directly to the speakers. Or for those who have difficulties with your connection or maybe the microphone, feel free to type it on the chat box and I will read it as I will monitor the chat window. I will first invite Mr. Safar Ahmad from Universitas Negeri Yogyakarta to give an opening remarks to open today's event and welcoming the speakers. Please, Mr. Safar, the time and floor is yours. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Mr.
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for my time. It is my honor to speak in front of all of you. My thanks go to Development Studies Club and also moderator Salsabila and other speaker Timothy P. Barnard and Ruizhi Choo and also other audience and participant for this seminar. Before maybe I try to see what moment is. Yeah. The topic of our seminar is doing animal history in Southeast Asia. Before I speak a little bit of this topic, I like to relate this topic to multidisciplinary approaches to history. Why I pay attention to multidisciplinary approaches? I see some students do not like history because to study history, it means that they must memorize the historical material. Indeed, we study history, it means that we should memorize some facts. But this is within a certain logical approaches to understand them. Accordingly, we should make uses of development of social sciences like the topic of our seminar. In this regard, I impressed by E.H. Carr, who believed that the more historical sociology becomes and the more sociological history becomes, the better for both. Yeah. I often ask to my student, what differentiates sarjana or scholar from a non-graduate? Because it is very important. To answer this question, I make comparison a scholar with a doctor. To become a true scholar, you are able to take a role like a doctor, namely examining patients. For doing so, doctor has tools like telescope, surgical tool. In this regard, tools become very important. Similarly, an undergraduate or graduate student should master the tools, namely theories, which are useful to analyze and synthesize even phenomena or realities. By mastering some theories, we are able to examine our patients in details. Our patients such as NU, Muhammadiyah, PKS, Ahmadiyah, to mention some, and etc. We should be able to know what are the diseases might infected them, or to know the differences among them, as well as the similarities among them. Such a doctor, a scholar, should have intention to view the patients, not politicize mere fortune of them. Furthermore, a scholar should encourage collaboration amongst them for better. It is through collaboration which support others to develop further. In regard with existence of some theories, knowledge or a truth is not monolithic. For example, up to now, the Netherlands doesn't recognize Indonesian independence on 17 August 1945, as the Netherlands employs theory of nation state based on Westphalia Treaty 1648 Anno Domini. On the other hand, Indonesia is established based on theory of nationalism. The consequences of these different theories imply different knowledge or truth. Either Indonesia or Netherlands persist on their belief, so that they should tolerate each other if they want to develop mutual diplomatic relation. Now, I want to discuss the topic of our seminar, namely doing animal history in Southeast Asia. In this case, I want to identify animals with technology. Later, I will discuss also another factor which influence the development of civilization, namely natural resources. Accordingly, technology is related to cultural progress, and culture is also determined by natural resources factors. So, there is a close relationship between culture, nature, and technology. Technology has very important role for progress of civilization. They are called developed country because they have advanced technology. America is called a country, superpower country, because it has advanced technology. Thanks to advanced technology, make America has strong both military and economically. We cannot say that Brunei or Saudi Arabia are developed countries because they have high per capita income due to lucky. In this case, I see technology as not only object, but knowledge system are also technology, namely soft technology. I believe that progress in the material aspect, such as developed country, is directly proportional to progress in immaterial field, namely soft technology. I think for instigate another discussion, I think it is enough. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Saffer, for the opening remarks. That was a really insightful one. Without further ado, let's hear the speaker's presentation. I will first welcome Mr. Timothy P. Barnard. Please, sir, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Salsabila. Sebelum saya mulai, saya ingin minta maaf karena ceramah ini dalam bahasa Inggris. Walaupun saya berbahasa Indonesia sedikit, sudah lama tak pakai. Sudah 30 tahun sejak tinggal di Indonesia, di Pekanbaru. Jadi bahasa saya agak ragu, merosot, dan lain-lain. Jadi semuanya akan dalam bahasa Inggris, tapi boleh bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia dan lain-lain. Jadi, okay, mulai. I've been asked today to talk about animals and history, and what I'll do is I have a bit of a presentation, and then I will pass the baton over to my colleague, Ruizhi. But so let me take over the screen here. Let me, oh, there it is. Okay. Let me, and then I can show you my thing. Okay. So what I would like to do today is talk about animals in history and environmental history, and why I choose to follow this way of looking at the past and how that has changed over time. I am trained as a historian of Indonesia. I originally worked on history of Sumatra and specifically Siak and state formation in Siak. And since moving to Singapore, I have shifted more to studying environmental history. And what you see on the screen is a book that will be published next month called Singaporean Creatures, which is part of a larger works that I have done on plants and animals in Singapore. And Mr. Choo is also part of this project. And so he'll be talking specifically about his own approach to animals and human history in Southeast Asia. So in Singapore, my examples will come from Singapore, but they're really about Southeast Asian history. When we study history in this region, whether it be Indonesian history, history of Asia Tenggara, history of other countries, we are usually doing it within the framework of Western historiography, in which we develop it around the ideas of politics and economics. We use traditional archives that discuss power and also emphasize the role of those who are the winners in history. And one of the things that attracted me to Southeast Asian history and to Indonesian history was the need to not use those traditional archives. I am not interested in the history of, just for example, Golkar, or Suharto and Sukarno and the development of the state. I am more interested in the peoples who live in Indonesia, for example, and how they developed and the issues they had to deal with, the orang biasa, if you will. And one of the ways I have learned that I can access that or develop that is through tools and approaches of environmental history. I do not consider myself an environmental historian. I am a historian of Southeast Asia. I study Indonesia, I study Singapore, I study Malaysia, I study these regions. But I use the tools and the approaches of environmental history to study that past. And what I have done is specifically focused on histories of plants and animals. So what I do is to not emphasize great men, let's just say like Sukarno or Suharto or Lee Kuan Yew. I instead often focus on a specific animal or plant to shift our perspective so we can think about society, human society, differently. Okay. And I will use Singapore as an example of this. When we study Singaporean history, Singapore history, for example, begins in 1819 with the arrival of the British. Just as Pak Shafur was mentioning, the Dutch have a different perspective. The Dutch will say 1949 instead of 45, for example, for Merdeka. In Singapore, we traditionally have a very imperialistic history. History begins in 1819. It's about the arrival of the British. The British develop a port, the government, the society. The migrants that come, whether they be Chinese, Orang Asia Tenggara, Indian, all are almost not important. It's about the state. And that state then goes through World War II, it becomes an independent nation. And this focus is very political, and it has a very colonial perspective that is rooted in imperialism. So that, for example, Singapore is the only nation in Southeast Asia where the colonial language is the language of interaction. Like I teach in English, not in Bahasa or in Chinese, for example. And that history usually revolves around the stories of great men or a great man, such as Raffles, Stanford Raffles, who was the colonial founder of modern colonial Singapore, or Lee Kuan Yew, the founding prime minister who passed away about 10 years ago. I am not happy with that history. I think it forgets the common people. It overlooks many important developments in the state. And so I look for alternative perspectives, perspectives that will focus on migration and the peoples that came here and form and make up Singapore today. Different classes of people, social and cultural developments outside of the halls of power. Okay? And the way I do that is through environmental history or animal history. So what I want to do now is take you through 3 different animals and how they can tell us about Singaporean history. So the key point I'm trying to make is if you study the history of animals, you learn more about human history, or you learn more about the society around us and how we understand it. The first example comes from a book I edited about 10 years ago called Nature Contained. And then the final 2 examples will be in the book Singaporean Creatures that's coming out next month. With the first example here, I want to talk about tigers in Singapore. Now you see the image on the right, that is a painting of a tiger disrupting a British attempt to develop roads in Singapore and to survey the roads and move out. And it's based on a true incident. This is a painting that can be found in the National Gallery of Art here in Singapore. And what it is depicting is a story of the arrival of British imperialism. The British want to develop roads. They want to expand out from the port. They want to colonize the island of Singapore. With the arrival of imperialism, one of the most important developments was not only the development of a port where ships could trade from China to India and the rest of Southeast Asia, but also the development of plantation agriculture. Singapore was, in 1819, was about 99% covered in jungle. Within 4 decades, within 40 years, the island was over 90% deforested. The jungle was cut down, plantations were put up, and the forest was much disturbed. This affected the environment. Many animals went extinct, new animals and plants were introduced, but more importantly for our story, it pushed the forest back from the port inland into Singapore and created a forest edge. And in this forest edge is where tigers live. And tigers began to swim over from Malaysia, what is Malaysia today, the Malay Peninsula, into Singapore in order to look for food. And they would often tigers do not live in deep jungle, they live on the edge of forests, because that is where animals such as deer or pigs or humans live, and they can be attacked and eaten and provide food for the tigers. So what happened as the forest was pushed back, as deforestation took place, was that there was a tremendous rise in tiger attacks in Singapore between the 1840s and 1860s. Literally dozens, if not hundreds, of tiger attacks a year. The victims of those tiger attacks were the poor, farmers who worked on these plantations, usually migrants. But more importantly, it developed this image of Singapore as this dangerous place in Southeast Asia, where tigers roamed and killed people. Now, they weren't going to kill your average person that lived in the port or a elite British merchant. They were going to kill a poor, primarily Chinese farmer. And this is what happened between the 1840s and 1860s. Singaporeans were dying from tiger attacks. I don't want to make it sound like 10 people died a day. I mean, in a year, let's say there'd be 20 people killed. Okay, we don't know the actual numbers because a lot of this was hidden. But what happened was tigers became equated with Singapore. There was a rise in tiger attacks, and that was due to the British coming in and imposing a new form of agriculture, a new form of economics on the system, on the island. Now, as the island became completely deforested, the number of tiger attacks declined because there was no longer an ecosystem. There was no longer a forest edge where the tigers could live. So the era of tigers in Singapore was over. We no longer have them here. And that is, I mean, that's a good thing. I don't want people to be eaten, but it was symbolic of that period of imperial rule and tells us about how the British gained control over the island and how that affected the landscape. Let me move on to another example. And the second example would be a history of mosquitoes. And this will be in the book, Singaporean Creatures. And this is related to disease and health and urban development. Mosquitoes are very small animals, but very important animals, mainly because they can transmit disease. You can catch malaria, you can catch dengue from mosquitoes. Now, one of the most important developments in the history of mosquitoes, if you will, or public health in Southeast Asia was the development of quinine. And the Dutch attempts to do that in Java through Buitenzorg or the Kebun Raya in Bogor, and how they developed quinine. This was important because without quinine, it was difficult for Europeans to come and gain control over parts of Southeast Asia. For example, in the 18th century, 50% of the Dutch people who were in Batavia at any time died that year. Now, how many of you would be willing to move to Jakarta if there was a 50% chance of dying in the coming year? I don't think very many people would, but that was the conditions at the time. The development of quinine was important, and also the understanding that mosquitoes transmit disease. Once they began to realize this, the colonial authorities began to try to prevent mosquitoes from being in society. And in Singapore, this was important for public health because they did not want the colonized to catch malaria or later dengue because it affected work productivity. If you're sick, you don't work well. Let's make you healthy so you can be a good colonial producer for capitalism. Now, the two most important mosquitoes in Singaporean history come from the genus Aedes and Anopheles, and that is because they can transmit dengue fever and malaria. Aedes for dengue, Anopheles for malaria. Anopheles, of course, was the first problem, if you will. What the government began to do was they developed an anti-mosquito service in which they would go out and try to correct the landscape, shape the landscape. And the photograph you see on the left is an example of this. They would take drains, the before and after, left and right. On the left, you have the original stream drain area. On the right, they put in concrete, let it flow, and therefore the mosquitoes cannot lay their eggs and grow there. this idea was prevalent throughout colonial Singapore. They would make concrete, they would develop areas, and they would ensure that mosquitoes couldn't develop for the Anopheles mosquitoes. This was good for public health. Now, what's interesting is malaria was a problem in Singapore until the early 1960s. It was a very colonial disease. After 1965, Singapore was basically malaria-free. You cannot catch malaria in Singapore. This is even true today. But you can catch dengue. And dengue only became important in Singapore after 1965, after Singapore became independent. And that is one of the reasons is when you think of Singapore today, you probably think of big buildings. I live, for example, in a 20-story building. It is very common in Singapore for people to live in very tall buildings, 20, 30 stories. This is what is called HDB, Housing Development Board. These are public houses the government builds, and then you can buy them from the government. And I know, for example, Mr. Choo has recently bought one. And it's very urban living. Well, this is important because the the Aedes mosquito, the dengue mosquito, lives in urban environments. It likes to live in tin cans and houses. It likes to live in your garden in your house. So as Singapore was building HDB, as they were building housing, they were also building an environment in which the Aedes mosquito will grow. And what happened was dengue went up. And even today, 15 to 20,000 people a year in Singapore catch dengue fever. Now, they replaced the kampongs, or as we spell it in Singapore, kampongs with an O. They replaced the kampongs with HDB. They developed a modern society, but what they also did was create an environment in which dengue fever becomes a common disease, in which everyone in Singapore knows someone else, if they have not had dengue, someone who has had it. And so the government, through the creation of this urban space, created a perfect environment for mosquitoes. Okay, that's one example. Let's turn to a nicer animal, monkeys. Monkeys are important. We can study monkeys in Singapore, and I'll go through this one quickly, because they can tell us a lot about human-animal relations and boundaries in a very urban, civilized space. Now, monkeys have always existed in Singapore, and one of the most common places to see monkeys, almost a tourist attraction, during the colonial era was the Singapore Botanic Gardens. You can see here a young woman feeding the monkeys as part of the appeal of the gardens. Now, as Singapore moved from colony to independent nation, new boundaries were being drawn. Modern boundaries were being drawn, in which people would say, okay, what is the space for humans? What is the space for animals? And as they began to view the Botanic Gardens as a park, as a place for humans, not animals, there was a decision made to get rid of the monkeys. And in 1971, the government sent the army into the Botanic Gardens to shoot monkeys. Okay, we'll have a few. And you can see on the right, this led to protests, mainly from white people, from Boules. And they began to protest the killing of monkeys in Singapore and the killing of monkeys in the Botanic Gardens. This made the government look bad. It wasn't good. But ultimately what it did was it moved the monkeys. The monkeys left, the monkeys that were not shot, moved to an area called the Central Catchment Area, which is a forested area for water reservoirs. And in other words, they created an area for monkeys. They created an area for humans, an area for civilized, and an area for savage. And so by moving monkeys through violence to a new area, they created new urban spaces in the state. So that today, when we enter those wild areas, we often will see signs like the one on the left, no feeding of monkeys. And this is areas where you can go for walks in Singapore and enjoy the forest and things like this. And so, but the point is, this was a created space. It was thought out of, okay, where do we let animals live? Where do we let humans live? And a park is no longer a place for animals. It is a place for humans to see plants and such. Okay. So let's bring this back around. And so before I pass it over to Mr. Choo, environmental history allows us to look differently at the histories we're interested in. You can study, for example, the history of Yogyakarta or the history of Java, but look at the role of tigers, or the types of animals you eat and the types of food and how they're raised. Or how do you deal with wild animals that may be running around? I don't know what wild animals are running around Yogyakarta, but how do you deal with issues like mosquitoes or other ones, or even things like the cicaks in your house and the role that they may play in eating animals and things. This is my goal and the goal of the various other people that present animal histories in the book that's coming out. But the idea is to get us to think differently about the past and to help us provide greater insight into how we understand society. With that said, I'll toss it over to Mr. Choo and let him gain control over the space, and then we'll see how it goes.
Okay. So I guess I'll just proceed. Thanks, Prof. Give me a moment just to share my screen. Okay. I just want to check can you all see this? Can you all see this? This is the first time experimenting with presenter view, so just to confirm you're seeing the.
It's a bit fancy, but we can see it.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Selamat siang semuanya, and aloha mai kako. Thank you very much for making time for my presentation today on Nature Condensed, the historical origins of the Singapore Zoological Gardens. My name is Ruizhi, and I'm a PhD student with the Department of History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So as the title would suggest, today I want to share with you some of the research I've actually done into the history of the Singapore Zoo over the past few years. So this was actually on my undergrad honors thesis, which I've been able to convert into a chapter in Prof. Barnard's upcoming edited volume. My presentation today will be structured around one simple question, and that is, why study zoos historically? In other words, what can we learn about human society or about the past in Southeast Asia or Singapore that we wouldn't otherwise learn if we applied more conventional approaches like political history, military history, or diplomatic history? What can zoos teach us about the past? So to answer this question, my presentation today is structured around two broad segments. The first one is more story-based. I will share with you some of the zoos that have occurred in Singapore's colonial period. And all of this leads to the second part of this story segment, which is to talk more specifically about the origins of the Singapore Zoological Gardens, which is actually the first zoo in Singapore, the first national zoo in independent Singapore's history. And I think more or less the only national zoo. The next part of my presentation, which is also the last part, is I will conclude by offering certain reflections and answers to why study zoos, and more broadly also about doing animal history in Southeast Asia. So that's roughly my presentation structure. But before I move on any further, I thought I wanted to give you all a few quick facts about the Singapore Zoo, because I think some of us might not necessarily be familiar about where and what exactly I'm talking about. So the Singapore Zoo is actually Singapore's first national zoo. And throughout the course of this presentation, you might hear me refer to it as the Singapore Zoological Gardens or the Singapore Zoo. And I mean the same thing. It's usually shortened to Singapore Zoo, but the more atas way of when people want to talk about it is the Zoological Gardens. So it's located in one of Singapore's bigger reservoirs, the Upper Seletar Reservoir. If you see the picture here on the top left-hand corner and you see the pin point there, you will see roughly it's in a green patch, and that's basically Singapore's central catchment reserve. It's more or less the only place where Singapore still has rainforests. And along the shores of this reservoir that we have, that's where the Singapore Zoo was built. So it was officially opened in June 1973. And actually this morning, as I was preparing for this presentation, I realized, oh wait, it's been 50 years since the zoo was actually officially open. So yeah, I don't think the zoo actually has a 50th anniversary, but it's quite amazing to think that this institution has actually survived for half a century. But the story of the zoo actually goes a bit further back. The planning for the Singapore Zoo actually happened in around 1968, just 3 years after Singapore gained its independence from Malaysia, when it separated from Malaysia. So when I was first starting out on my research, I think many years ago, about the history of the Singapore Zoo, it really struck me, like when I learned about the history of Singapore in the textbooks, they always talk about Singapore's early independence, that period as a time of disorder, chaos. But here you have just 3 years after independence, right? Amidst all the struggles, the political turmoil and instability, Singapore's leaders were thinking, hey, let's just build a zoo somewhere in the center of the city. So the question that of course occurred to me is, why? Why would they spend so much resources, and why would they suddenly decide to build a zoo? And to answer this question, and because I guess I'm a history student, I think the answer, I need to contextualize and try to answer this question by going a bit further back in time to Singapore's colonial period, looking at, well, loosely speaking, zoos, but also other sorts of animal displays in Singapore's colonial period. So the point of this segment is to show you that the Singapore Zoological Gardens, our first national zoo, didn't happen just because maybe one day Lee Kuan Yew woke up and decided, let's have a zoo. It didn't happen that way. Singapore has a very long tradition of collecting, displaying, and also just going to look at animals. So it was something that Singaporean residents, even if they weren't citizens, it was something that they used to do maybe in their free time. So it was very much part of the cultural and social fabric of people who lived in Singapore. It was something that they would go and do. It was something that people in Singapore, if they had money, if they liked animals, that would be a collection that they would make. And some of the earliest animal collections that you could actually be found in the archives, at least, occurred in the 1850s. These were animal collections by very wealthy Chinese businessmen. And according to the newspapers, there would apparently be tapirs, rare birds, bears, and giraffes, even giraffes that could be found. So these collections were often situated in their very big residences. They had big houses, right? Because they were rich businessmen. And on special occasions, maybe Chinese New Year, they would have an open house. They would open their residences for people to come and look at these exotic animals. And of course, they most likely procured and bought these animals from the port of Singapore. One thing to understand is that in this period, as early as the 1850s, Singapore was already a place where you could actually buy lots of exotic animals from the port. It was a place in which many people collected animals from different parts of the Nusantara, whether in Sulawesi or Java or Sumatra, and then they would sell it at Singapore to maybe often European or American collectors. But all these collections were actually private. There wasn't actually a public zoo until 1875 with the zoo at the Botanical Gardens, which Prof. Barnard, I think, alluded to earlier. The zoo was actually founded in 1875 and it ran for about almost 30 years. So this was often a place in which the colonial government would actually display a lot of the animals that it received as gifts from a lot of the many dignitaries, diplomats, or rulers. For instance, I think there was a bear that the King of Siam actually gave to the colonial government. What's the colonial government going to do with a bear, right? So they actually have to put all these animals in a particular place. So if you see the pictures here, these are pictures of more or less the same space. It's called the bandstand at the Botanical Gardens. The black and white picture is an older picture of it, I think in the early 1900s, and it still exists today. If you ever go down to the botanical gardens and you go to this place, a lot of couples like to take their wedding pictures here. But the story I always like to tell my friends when we are here is somewhere in this area that you are in the botanical gardens, there used to be a zoo. And this zoo actually housed a lot of exotic birds. There were Sumatran rhinoceroses. There were even kangaroos. And I think one time a tiger even escaped briefly from this zoo. It was part of the collection. So it was a place in which members of the public, they didn't have to be very rich. They could actually go there in their free time to look at it. And there are newspaper reports of Malays and Chinese laborers in their free time. They would go and they were always very amused by kangaroos. You know, they'd never seen a kangaroo before. So this zoo actually ran for a period of almost 30 years, and it was closed due to a lack of funding eventually from the colonial government. Felt like it was a very, very high expense. And so because of a lack of funding, it eventually fell into disrepair. But this was basically the island of Singapore's first public zoo. But of course, understand that at this point in time, Singapore is still a colony. It wasn't so much a nation state yet. But it was a place in which people could go in their free time. The next significant place in which exotic animals were displayed, which I could find at least in the newspaper articles, was a private zoo owned by this man called William Basapa, and it ran from 1928 to 1942. So that's about 20 years after the zoo at the Botanical Gardens closed down before anything very significant opened up again. So it wasn't just a place that you could go to look at animals. If you were rich enough and on a particular day you were feeling like buying an elephant, and if you had enough money, you could purchase that elephant from the exhibit if you had maybe 200 spare British pounds with you. So not only elephants, there were tigers, sea lions, kangaroos, orangutans, and polar bears. So all of this, a lot of foreign visitors wrote about their memoirs about William Basapa's zoo when they came to visit, and this was apparently a very huge tourist attraction. So the zoo actually lasted until 1942 when it was destroyed on the eve of the Japanese invasion of Singapore. The colonial government ordered that all the predators in the zoo, all the carnivores, had to be destroyed. And the exotic birds were released into the jungles of Singapore at this point in time. And after the war, this Punggol Zoo run by William Basapa was actually bulldozed. And the story goes that William Basapa died of a broken heart because he never could actually revive the Punggol Zoo. But that's the Punggol Zoo. Zoos in post-war Singapore after the Second World War continued. There were still many, many kinds of zoos that opened up. Just to give you an example, there was the zoo at Tampines Road in the 1950s. There was the Singapore Miniature Zoo in 1957. There was a proposal even to open a zoo at Great World Amusement Park. And Great World Amusement Park is actually a theme park that was very, very popular. When I talk to people of my grandparents' generations, they remember this very fondly. But this proposal for a zoo was rejected by city officials because they were very afraid that what happens, if a tiger escapes, then it'll be let loose in the middle of the city, because that's where Great World was actually situated. In the 1960s, there was also a second Punggol Zoo, but this time it was run by a Chinese businessman who imported rhesus monkeys for scientific research. So he also broadened out to display a lot of more other kinds of exotic animals. So these were all many kinds of private zoos. And the point of this is to show you that actually people were really interested. I think, as this picture might suggest, people were going to zoos. And because there was a demand for these zoos, the very fact that these zoos existed, these private zoos existed, suggests that it was very, very profitable as a place that to attract visitors and tourists to go to. It was profitable enough for people to continually open them, even if they shut down eventually. So on top of these private zoos, there was a continuing debate and discussion for a public zoo throughout most of the 1950s and 1960s. So that's about 20 years, where every few years somebody would write in, like a very distinguished person maybe would suggest, Singapore is such a prestigious city, it's time it has a zoo, and the government, which was a colonial government at this point in time, should spend money to have a public zoo so that it can add to the prestige of Singapore as a city. So you can see there was very much a very lingering and very long-held fascination and tradition of not just collecting, displaying, but also going to view animals in Singapore. So it was the fact that the Singapore Zoo eventually arose, it actually comes as part of a very, very long pattern, stretching back to maybe the 1850s of people going to look at animals. So, I mean, some of the pictures you see here, I drew from the National Archives of Singapore. This was from the collection, the photo collection of the Singapore Miniature Zoo, which I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, there is a rhinoceros. There are even penguins there. So this would be, you could actually, you know, if you had a few cents and you had a free Saturday, this was a place you could actually go to with your date or with your family. So I think with this historical context, this long pattern established, I think it makes more sense when it's time to talk about a zoo for the nation. And here I will actually go into the origins of the Singapore Zoo and to tell you some of the considerations and stories that led to the founding of the Singapore Zoological Gardens. So just to maybe offer a bit of context, Singapore gained its independence in 1965. And one of the most iconic images of this separation from Malaysia, which effectively meant independence for Singapore, was our first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, crying on national television. Everyone likes to make memes about Lee Kuan Yew crying. You know, they make a lot of jokes. But I think this picture sort of encapsulates how worried and anxious both him and a lot of the leaders and ordinary citizens of Singapore were about Singapore at this point in time. How is this little island nation going to survive? And so there were a lot of challenges that Singapore faced in 1965. How were they going to build the country up? Despite that, right, in 1965, there are the first documented discussions about building a zoo. Many leaders from Singapore were actually entering into conversations with people like the Australian High Commissioner to actually talk about, can we seek your advice to actually build a zoo? So the question is, you know, in the face of so much significant economic, social, and political challenges, there were also a lot of, you know, Singapore gained its independence in a time where it was politically very unstable in the region as well. Why would Singapore's leaders even think of building a zoo? That to me was the enduring research puzzle as I went along in my research. So many answers, many ways to answer this question, but this is my idea of why I think they decided to do that. It was a new nation with new ambitions. For instance, Singapore was also very concerned about its water security. Another thing to know about Singapore's history is that it was very much connected. It relied very much on Malaysia for its water supply. And just after independence, Malaysia's leaders actually told Singapore, you better behave, otherwise we can turn off your water at any time. So there was a push to actually develop more sources of water so that Singapore would be less dependent on Malaysia for water. So there was this push for water security, but at the same time, there was also this policy by newly independent Singapore for the garden city. So this garden city policy was in effect an effort to make Singapore clean and green, to create a new space in which all these urbanized Singaporeans would have a place to relax, but it was also a way to sort of control the population by creating these kind of new green spaces. So some of the leaders who are involved, if you go and look up water security or garden city, you will see names like Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee. But unlike many of the stories of Singapore where Lee Kuan Yew plays a big role, actually in the story of the zoo, the Singapore Zoo at least, Lee Kuan Yew himself doesn't really play a big role. In fact, he was very skeptical about having a zoo along the reservoirs, because this was the idea. They wanted to build a zoo along one of the reservoirs to better make use of the space there. He was very worried, right? If you're going to have a zoo along the reservoir, what happens to all the animal shit? What happens to the elephant shit? Isn't it going to pollute the water? So there were all these concerns, and these were tied to water security also. But after a lot of assurances that, you know, we are going to take care of the shit, we will make sure that the sewage is processed properly, Lee Kuan Yew also gave his approval. So the Singapore Zoo was actually imagined, at least by the leaders, as a recreational space for Singaporeans. Many Singaporeans were living in the city now. And at that point in time, Singaporeans, actually now also, we live in very cramped conditions, very cramped and stressful conditions. So the idea of having different parks and gardens and green spaces around the city was to allow Singaporeans to de-stress, to relax. So the Singapore Zoological Gardens became one of these gardens in the garden city for Singaporeans to relax. So this is a picture of that. And so there was a worldwide search, you know, once they decided that, okay, we're going to build a zoo. But we're not just going to build an ordinary zoo. We're going to build one of the most modern zoos in the world, and it will be an open concept zoological garden. It wasn't just going to be a zoo or animal exhibit. It was going to be a scientific zoological garden. Sounds very, very profound and deep. And this was deliberate because they wanted, I think, the Singapore Zoo to represent the best of this new nation. So they also engaged external consultants from all around the world. And one of the most notable was Lindy Alvis, who was actually the director of the Dahiwala Zoo in Sri Lanka. So it's quite clear, I think, that the Singapore Zoo the zoological gardens was intended as part of the gardens, as you can see from this speech by Goh Keng Swee at the opening of the Singapore Zoo, that the Singapore Zoological Garden is the latest and welcome addition to the amenities available to residents of Singapore. So it was basically part of this project and pattern. So that's so much for the leaders and the kind of plans they had. But I think when we deal with animals in history, the thing that's always very interesting and exciting to me is how animals don't always follow our plans. Those of us who have pets will know this, that animals never listen to you. Or, you have one plan, but they will do other things. So it was like that for the animals in the zoo also. And one of the most exciting things happened in, I think, March 1973, when there's 3 months before the zoo was supposed to be officially open, a 3-year-old panther, actually escaped from the zoo into the jungles of Singapore. And this triggered a lot of excitement. The Singapore Army was deployed. The police were actually activated to go and look for this panther, this man-eating carnivore that was on the loose in the city. There were a lot of Singaporeans who were very excited. So as you can see from some of the headlines I pulled, residents joined in the hunt. Ordinary Singaporeans were volunteering to catch this animal. They didn't know where it was, but they were volunteering their expertise to go and track down this animal. But on the other hand, there were also other Singaporeans, like this writer, who was actually a 9-year-old student, who said, please don't kill the panther, capture it alive. It's not the panther's fault. So there were a whole array of responses to this animal escape. But the point I want to make is that, they were all Singaporeans themselves were actually very excited about the idea of this animal loose in their city. So finally, in January 1974, and this panther has been on the loose for almost 11 months. They finally catch and surround it in a storm drain somewhere in the western part of Singapore. So this is a picture taken, I think, one night before the Twiggy the panther, this escaped panther, was actually flushed out of the storm drain, this longkang in which she was actually trapped in. So you can see there are a lot of policemen, there are a lot of people curious, and they don't really know what to do. And so what they actually did to this panther who was trapped in this longkang was to throw a lot of smoke bombs, pour burning petrol into this drain in an effort to flush out this panther. We don't really know what happened, but after 2 days, there wasn't any noise. So they decided, sounds like probably the panther died or something happened to it. So they decided to flood the drain. But even as they did so, a lot of policemen were on standby with submachine guns. These are the newspaper reports saying that, getting ready in case this dangerous animal came out. So as you're reading all these articles, you think, man, this is a very dangerous animal. How is it going to... It must be such a huge creature and it must be so dangerous. And I myself was surprised when finally I saw the picture of how big Twiggy was. And so here, I think you can see on the bottom right-hand picture, that is the size of Twiggy the panther, the animal, the panther who was on the loose for 11 months. And everyone was so excited and afraid of. It's just slightly maybe bigger than an average sized dog. So I think this whole episode shows how strongly ordinary Singaporeans themselves could feel about animals. There were also a lot of other animal escapes in this period. I think because of the idea of an open concept zoo, it was very new. Nobody really knew how to tighten these enclosures and make them secure so that animals wouldn't escape. This was very new technology, right? The idea of having a zoo where there didn't seem to be cages. So there was this eland, this antelope that escaped, but there was also a huge Nile hippopotamus that sort of escaped into the reservoir. So I don't have a picture of the hippopotamus itself, but basically it was so big that they had to wait for the hippopotamus to walk back by itself, and it did after about 40 or 50 days. So this is the story of the escapes. And I think that's an interesting parallel to what was happening, the plans that leaders had laid out. So finally, in June 1973, the Singapore Zoo opens. And I think this is one of my favorite pictures of this episode, where this gentleman was shaking hands with the orangutan. So just to be clear, the gentleman is the one on the right. Shaking hands with the shorter creature there is the orangutan. That's Goh Keng Swee, the man shaking the hands. He was one of the top leaders in Singapore at this point in time, and he was very much responsible for supporting the development of the zoo. And I think those of you who might be familiar with the Singapore Zoo might know a very famous orangutan known as Ameng the orangutan. That's actually not Ameng. That was actually Susie the orangutan. And she was initially supposed to be the mascot, but she died of pregnancy complications sometime in the late 1970s. So you can see, I think these are very unexpected pictures we otherwise wouldn't see, I think, if we just studied political history, right? So I thought this was very funny. I was just looking at Goh Keng Swee's speech this morning, and he says that, understand this, right? As Goh Keng Swee, as the zoo is being opened, somewhere in the jungles, Twiggy, the panther, the escaped panther, is actually still on the loose. So maybe I didn't make this clear, but basically the panther has escaped, and they are not going to catch the panther for another 6 more months after Goh Keng Swee makes this speech. So I thought it's just very funny that he said that, animals in this zoo are not confined to cages, except for fully dangerous animals like panthers. So I think he definitely was aware that this panther had escaped. So just to close off this story, the Singapore Zoo opened in 1973, and just slightly more than a year later, it had received its 1 millionth visitor. And I think it's very surprising to us now. I think if you look up the Singapore Zoo today, it often seems like a place for rich tourists to go. A lot of the things are priced very expensively. But there was a time in which the zoo was aimed mainly at Singaporeans. It was made to be affordable to Singaporeans. And I think it's very clear based on the newspaper articles I showed you, and also the visitorship numbers, right, that many Singaporeans were actually visiting. So understand that 1 million visitors by November 1974 is at a time when Singapore's population was just slightly more than 1 million people, I think, or in the hundreds of thousands. So the fact that so many people have visited, I think, very much goes to show how popular it was. So the Singapore Zoo became a recreational educational space for very stressed, urbanized Singaporeans. And it was also part of the Garden City project. And of course, it attracted a lot of excitement amongst ordinary Singaporeans. So this, again, is the headline I had. I thought it was very compelling, because often we just hear the words and speeches of politicians, but it's always very fascinating to me when I see an article where people are being excited and emotional about certain things. So here are some pictures, again, of people shaking hands with orangutans. So I want to now close off this presentation by offering some reflections to my original question, which is, why study zoos historically? I think when we study zoos, it gives us a way to... zoos are a space in which our understandings of nature are shaped and changed and expanded. I'm not sure about you, but every time I go to the zoo, even though I think I know an animal, it's very different, right? Observing an animal just in front of you, or the kind of things you learn about exotic animals you might not otherwise learn. Additionally, the Singapore Zoo, and I'm very sure for zoos in different countries as well, it became a place where people can have very strong opinions, whether it's the leaders who want to build the zoo as a point of civic pride, but also of ordinary citizens who maybe have opinions about, why do you have this animal? Can this animal be eaten or not? This is often a question I hear when people are talking about animals in the zoo. And I think most importantly and finally, it was also a space in which it was a global space where Singaporean leaders were actually borrowing ideas, animals, and practices from different regions around the world. So the Singapore Zoo is a Singapore Zoo, but it's also made of different ideas, different animals, different enclosures and materials from different parts of the world. So I want to close now. This is my final slide. Bear with me a few more minutes about doing animal history in Southeast Asia, which is basically the theme of today's panel. I think some of the value of doing animal history in Southeast Asia is structured into why, what, and how. First, I think it offers us fresh perspectives. It allows us to ask new questions and new answers. But on top of that, it also gives us new ways to look at old questions, themes, and issues. So I think, honestly, if you wanted to, there can be a new angle to look at Singaporean politics or Indonesian politics by just looking at how people have talked about zoos or how politicians have imagined animals as well. More on the material side of the what, we can also look at the animals, both the exotic and the ordinary. We can look at the spaces in which these animals were either housed or where they escaped to. I think the other space is also an imaginary, mental, and psychological space. How did people think of animals? How did they talk about them? And how did these ideas change as well? And finally, the question, of course, that confronted me early on in my undergraduate, when I was in my undergraduate days was, how are we even going to write a history of the zoo? A lot of people told me that's impossible, but actually there are a lot of documentary sources. There are newspaper reports, there are photographs, and also there are memories and oral histories. And just to prove your point, just prove the point, this is a picture of me at the zoo when I was very young. I don't know whether you can see the resemblance. I've probably changed a lot, but yeah, I have memories of the zoo as well. And every time I tell people I'm doing the zoo, people also have ideas of the zoo. So I think looking at the zoo allows us many ways to do animal history in Southeast Asia, but it also gives us new ways to think of Southeast Asia. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for bearing with me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the insightful presentation, Mr. Barnard and Mr. Cho. We've learned so much about doing animal history in Southeast Asia by having Singapore as our case study. So from the first presentation, we know that aside from the Western framework historiography, there are other alternatives, and I want to encourage everyone here to check the book that has been mentioned earlier when it's already launched, entitled Histories of Humans and Other Animals. And the second one is also as insightful as the first one, rereading some from their reflections. Animal history field help giving a new perspective on an issues by studying the animals, faces, and imaginations through documentary sources, memories, and oral histories. So as we have heard a lot of new insights from our speakers, I believe the participants have a lot of burning questions, and now is the right time to have the Q&A session. For those of you who want to ask your question directly, you may use the raise hand features, and I will call on you to ask your question aloud. Or you can also type your questions into the chat box, but please make sure you also stated to whom you directed your questions to. And oh yeah, feel free also to type your question in bahasa, and I will try to help translating it. So jadi untuk teman-teman yang ingin bertanya dalam bahasa juga diperbolehkan, silahkan saja dituliskan dan nanti akan saya bantu sampaikan dalam bahasa Inggris. Then okay, sini udah ada satu. There already one person who raised hand. Please, Said, the floor is yours. Yes, I think there's some problem with your connection.
Hello.
Yeah, you're audible, but it's a bit unclear. You may just turn off your camera if there's some problem with your connection.
Hello.
Okay. Yeah, now it's clear and audible. Please.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask. In Indonesia, we have a botanical garden called the Bogor Botanical Garden or Kebun Raya Bogor, which was a botanical center of the world in Dutch colonial era. My question is, how we develop the Bogor Botanical Garden area to attract tourists and young people so it benefits to everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sai, for the question. Maybe from Mr. Barnard or Mr. Cho.
I can answer this. I wrote a book about the botanic gardens in Singapore, so okay. The key thing, I will write it in the. There are two very important historians of the Buitenzorg Botanic Gardens, the Bogor Botanic Gardens. The first is a man named Andrew Goss, who wrote a book called The Florocrats. And the second is a young man who currently is in, I believe, Jakarta, named Lutfi Adam, and they both received their PhDs studying about the Bogor Botanic Gardens. The issue with the Bogor Botanic Gardens is really a question of, to get people interested in them today is the job of the local government and the people at the gardens. They were the most important colonial botanic gardens in the world, more important than Singapore even, and that hurts me to say that for someone who wrote about Singapore. They are very important. I think everyone should visit. It is a important place. It is a historic place in which you can learn a lot about Indonesia. You can learn a lot about colonialism and imperialism there. And there are serious historians who work on this. And I think that's a very good question. But as for how to get people interested, I'm not sure. That's up to the modern botanic gardens today. But for us as historians, we do have writings and work that study it. It is a very good, very deep topic. You know, just because two people are working on it doesn't mean no one else can. There's a lot of material there, and I would recommend you as Indonesians to go visit the place and make it to study its histories, I should say.
Thank you, Mr. Barnard. Maybe Mr. Choo, do you have any addition to that or any comment? Or
No,
maybe
I really can't say any, because like that's really not my field. But I've been to the Bogor Botanical Gardens, and all I can say is it's definitely such an important place, and I really need to learn more about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Choo.
Timothy,
Yes.
I want to ask how we attract young people to go to Bogor Botanical Garden.
That I am not a good representative of tourism. The places I visit are not. I would say just emphasize to young people and to students the importance of the Botanic Gardens. It is important for Indonesian history. It is important as also a beautiful place to visit and important, and then leave it up to the individual. One problem is with any museum or historical place is getting people to visit it. People like to go to the shopping mall. They like to go to the fancy new place today. I don't have a solution to that. I'm an old person. Sudah tua. So how to get younger people interested in that, I'm not sure. But perhaps let them know about the interesting stories that occurred there and the interesting things that happened there. And perhaps that will attract more visitors.
Thank you, Mr. Barnard, for the answers. Maybe from Said, do you have any follow-up questions or maybe a comments respond to that? Or it's clear enough?
Thank you, it's clear enough.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. We actually have one question in the chat box direct to me directly, but I think I'm gonna call History Education B first. Please, you may deliver your question.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Gilang from Yogyakarta State University. I'm sorry for my bad English. I have a question. What do you think about the animals that are worked by the circus, like an elephant, monkey, dolphin, and many more? And also, they being treated in a critical manner by their owner. Because I'm sure there are still a lot of these things out there in every country. So how do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. That's a really interesting one. Maybe Mr. Cho or Mr. Barnard, who wants to answer it first?
You want to go first, or you want me to go? Right.
No, I was thinking you would probably have something to say, especially with dolphins.
I think, okay, one thing we have to think about is, as history students, is the role of a circus or a zoo today, and then what we have to study it in the past. Look, just because I'll give you an example. I personally do not like zoos. I do not like circuses. I don't like going to see an animal in a cage, and I just don't like it. Okay. I'm not a member of organizations that protest zoos, but I just don't like it. But I also understand these are important ways that people saw animals in the past. So you had circuses, you had zoos, and they are important to study so we can understand how humans understood animals and the relationship to them and such. And that's the way I look at it. Now, you can also study imperialism and not like imperialism, for example. It doesn't make you an imperialist to study imperial history. And it's the same thing with circuses and zoos. I don't like them. I personally do not like to visit zoos. Ruizhi knows, I think I've been to the Singapore Zoo once because my wife had free tickets. So we went and I walked around and things like that, but I don't, no thank you. So the thing is, that is about zoos or circuses in modern society, but then our role as a historian. It's something we want to study as a topic, and it was an important part of society. And so, okay, I accept they existed. I may not like them. I might find them cruel today, but we have to understand how they fit into society in the past. I would say go visit the Botanic Gardens with Saeed. There, you won't have any animals harmed there. And so, so that's, I don't know what Ruizhi's understanding or his feeling about zoos are, but I've never been a big fan of them. Or, I mean, a lot of this comes from, frankly, when I lived in Indonesia before and I would visit zoos, I was like, I thought they were terrible. Like I'm very old. This is like the 1980s. And then, like 40 years ago when I would see zoos, I didn't like them. Okay, sorry, Ruizhi. Yeah.
Okay. No, I don't have anything much to add because I think I totally agree, except that I went to zoos more often as a kid. I went to circuses also. I think it's only when I got older I was like, wow, these things are really awful, and the kind of things that they make animals do, right? And the ways in which they make the animal look like it's happy or funny or sarcastic. With that said, I think I just wanted to add, I think Prof. Barnard made a very good point about, as historians, what do we do with these circus animals and zoos, right? I realized not many people really write about circuses or zoos or the animals around them. So I had a hard time thinking about how to even write about them. And I think I sort of arrived at sort of a rough answer to do that. And I do think it is worth studying the history of animals in circuses or zoos or places in which animals perform, right? Because once you take that and you unpack it, you look at how did these animals come about? How did people learn how to train them? Where did they learn these things from? I think it gives us many, many different possibilities and ways to think about a place or to think about a practice which we wouldn't otherwise have if we just learn about the history of Indonesia or we learn the history of Singapore or Malaysia. When we learn the histories of animals, these exotic animals, right? How much would you pay for an elephant? How much would you pay to train a sea lion? I think these questions allow us to see different things that which we wouldn't otherwise even consider, right? And if you take them, it sounds very silly to ask such questions, but I think if you can take these silly questions and look at them seriously, you can, I think, arrive in very, very interesting places. Yeah, so it's not really a direct answer to your question, but I think there are possibilities there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Barnard and Mr. Choo, for the answers. That's really clear and insightful. Maybe I'm giving back to Gila. Do you have any comments, follow-up comments or follow-up questions? for the speakers, or it's clear enough?
I have Gilang, do you go to the zoo or do you go to circuses?
Yeah, maybe I like to know further about the research of Brother Ruizhi Choo. Maybe if you find like economical dimension or political dimension, because like everything have material aspect, have material aspect, or have maybe if the program might be good, for program just program for government, it is good for earning money.
Yes.
Maybe some a businessman make use of this program, or political campaign, and so on. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Saiful. That's exactly the question. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to answer this question, because it's really something I didn't get a chance to talk about. Partly because I come from, in Singapore, the histories they tell is always about the money they make, right? It's always about the politics and how successful the politics is. So I made a deliberate decision in telling this story today, not to talk about politics and economics, but you are definitely right. There is a material, political, and economic dimension to this. The Singapore Zoo made a lot of money. I think you all would perhaps know this. I think especially in the 1980s, when they decided that it's not going to be sustainable just to aim to cater just to Singaporeans. Let's turn to the international market. And so in the 1980s, Singapore globalized. They brought a lot of companies here to invest, to set up their factories. But at the same time, they were also aiming at tourists, specifically usually Japanese tourists. One of the innovations they actually had was also to have breakfast at the zoo with orangutans. So this is a point in Singapore, in the history of Singapore Zoo, where Aming the orangutan becomes very, very famous. Aming has orangutans are not endemic to Singapore. They're not the native species, but Singaporeans felt very strongly. They felt very connected to this orangutan. Okay, but anyway, I strayed a bit. But to go back to the economic and political dimensions, they hit upon this magic formula. They realized that actually it's such a unique proposition, right, to eat breakfast with orangutans, that gradually over time, I think in the space of less than 10 years, the international visitor numbers increased 10 times, from about 20,000 visitors to about over 200,000 visitors, I think, by the mid-1980s. So I think you know this also. The Singapore Zoo there are very economic dimensions to this. They're always, these days, especially about making money. So yes, this was one of the huge tourist draws in a particular time. Less so these days, but definitely they're always looking to attract more tourists. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Thank
it is related to tourism also, because
very much so.
Also tourism, heritage, and so on.
Yes, yeah.
Please answer, Saiful.
Yeah, like zoo as also as a mean for education and many things, I think. Yeah, enough.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Saiful. Maybe we can proceed to the questions again, because we still have 3 left, actually. So one that sent to me directly on the private message. What are the challenges in writing about environment history? Maybe Mr. Barnard and Mr. Choo can share your
Okay. Excellent question. There's several challenges. One is the type of sources you use, and that's one of the things I like about it. You cannot go to an archive and just find, for example, dogs or tigers. You have to put together many different resources. So there may be reports that are hidden in other archives or in newspaper reports or oral histories. And that is always what attracted me to Southeast Asian history, For example, when I started with Indonesian history, I always worked with hikayats, syairs, and oral histories. I worked with understanding of maps and other things that wouldn't be a normal resource if I was studying history in Europe or America. And so one of the big challenges with doing environmental history is the range of sources you have to have, number one. Number two, it helps if you have a little bit of knowledge of biology or science. I am no scientist, but sometimes you have to study a bit more about plants or how plants develop or animal behavior, for example. The third problem, and this sounds very egotistical, is just having people understand its history. Like in my books that I write about environmental history are not even in the library in the history section for like Singapore or Indonesia. They're off in other areas of the library. So, or even if you go to a bookstore, they're in the ecology environment area, not in the history section. And I find that strange because I think of myself as a historian first, but they put me in the environmental ecology section. And so, it's about, I'll say respect. It's not real history, if you will. So. Okay. Do you have anything to add, Ruizhi?
Sorry, this question is about the challenges of
doing environmental history, or what are the problems?
Oh, I think you've covered most of it. I think the struggle for me as a grad student also, less so in America, but in Singapore, when I tell people I want to do environmental history, nobody knows what to do with me. Like, it's still a relatively new field in Southeast Asia. So traditional historians or policymakers, they'll be like, oh, environmental history. So are you interested in climate change or global warming? It's such a broad, everyone has a different understanding, that the field is so broad that sometimes it takes a while for people to understand what you're doing. It also takes a while for you to understand exactly where you want to situate yourself also. Because if you think about it, right, everything is the environment. The computer you're looking at, the room you're sitting in can arguably be part of the environmental history as well. So I think for me, that was the biggest challenge. Like, what questions do I ask? What do I, there's such a huge buffet. Where do I situate myself? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Barnard and Mr. Choo. Actually, we still have 5 questions. So do you guys mind to answer all of it? But we might extend the meeting a little bit, or I can just pick 2.
Oh, you go ahead.
I'm happy. Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Next, the question is coming from Marsha Phoebe. She has 2 questions. Maybe I'm just gonna deliver the 2. So the first question: by putting animals and environment as the focus of historical inquiry, how would that impact our understanding of historical periodization? That's the first one. And the second one: human-centric history may focus on human migration and societal development, but development and migration often comes hand in hand with displacement, including that of the natural environment. So how would we understand and see displacement through this lens, especially in Southeast Asia as a region? Maybe Mr. Barnard or Mr. Choo, you may.
Yeah, I can answer both of them fairly quickly. The idea of periodization, absolutely, when you focus on animals and not we'll say normal periodization, it changes it very much. I will give you an example from Indonesia. If we begin with the arrival of the Dutch, for example, and then we go up through kind of 1942, the Japanese, or 1945, kemerdekaan, or 1949, the Dutch finally go. And then you have, Zaman Soekarno. And then you have Order Baru and things like this. That's the normal periodization. In Singapore, it's 1819 to 1942, 1942 to 45, almost the same thing. When I look at animals or plants, there are other much more important developments that have nothing to do with political developments. So, for example, when you look at animals, the deforestation that occurs is much more important Then from 1819, I would almost start a new era about 1880 when they try to replant the forest. And what becomes apparent is like the World War II or the early late colonial era, after World War II, before independence, are not that important because it's the same policies. What the modern government of Singapore does today is often very related to what the British were doing. So there's no change. So you would say, for example, nature reserves in Singapore began around 1930, and they continue to today. The Japanese don't matter. The end of colonialism doesn't matter. But if you want to look at nature reserves, the periodization is very different. Okay, that's number one. Absolutely. The idea of displacement, that was really the second question. That was what I was talking about with monkeys. You have monkeys in a particular area of Singapore. As Singapore reconfigures or thinks about its urban space and development, we'll get rid of the monkeys. We'll push them to a different area. And that's essentially what they do with urban development, with the development of the society. You determine where animals live, where humans live. And that can tell you a lot about how they see the space. Okay.
I just want to add to that. Definitely, I think that's also why I think studying animals is so exciting, because it allows us different periodizations. I don't know whether you've noticed this, although I kept saying that the zoo was officially opened in 1973. I actually end my timeline in 1974. It may not be there, I forgot whether I put it in, but I basically decide to do that because that's when Twiggy the panther dies, right? And to me, that is a very nice way to end the episode of the opening of the Singapore Zoo. So that's one example, but I think to sort of answer the question about displacement also, I think when we study animals or environmental history, we can see different patterns which we might not otherwise see. So I think patterns of displacement which might not otherwise be so apparent when we look at histories of politics or the histories of military histories. For instance, Prof. Barnard has a chapter in Nature contained about tigers, right? You mentioned tigers. I always thought it was great because when you see if you track the number of tigers in Singapore, it's not a history of tigers coming out of the jungle. Another way to see it is the history of how these forests were being cleared and people were encroaching into the spaces so that there were more tiger attacks. So the history of animals, or the history of how people were writing about animals, how animals appeared in newspaper articles when they attack human beings, can also be a history of displacement. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think to go more broadly is, I think, to the original point, is that I think animals allows us to see new patterns, whether it's across time in new periodizations or across space as well, in terms of displacement and movements as well.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you, Mr. Choo. That was really insightful. So we have another question coming from Ferdian. So good afternoon. I have a question for Professor Barnard and Professor Choo. Have you seen notable shift in how people view and treat animals in Southeast Asia, or in this case of your specialization in Singapore throughout history? What do you think has caused these changes? Thank you, and he stated and expressing his enjoyment during their presentation.
Mm-hmm. I can answer this one very easily because I wrote another book called Imperial Creatures, which is about animals in Singapore from 1819 to 1942, so during kind of British colonialism. And in the book, there is a lot of violence. Dogs are killed. There's a lot of animals being killed in the book. And I've had readers tell me, oh, I didn't like the book because so many animals, the way they treat, treating animals. And somehow they think I'm the one. I'm like, I'm not being cruel. I just want you to understand what's happening and the events that are developing. But what we have today, people today are very, I'm going to use the phrase, distant from animals. We live in societies where you may have a pet, but you may have a pet bird or a cat, something like that. But we don't really interact with animals. We don't, for example, kill the food we eat. You go to the grocery store, you go to the pasar, and you buy your ayam, okay, or your kambing, and you cook it up. But you're not the one who got, who slaughtered the animal. So what has really happened over the last 50 years or so is we've gotten more distant from our animals. And the animals that we do keep near us are pets, that we keep them in cages or keep them in the house and give them special food and things like this. And so absolutely our relationship to animals has changed. And the primary reason is because of how distant we are from them now. They're not part of our lives for the most part.
I'll just add to that with my specific instance of the zoo. First of all, I need to clarify, I'm not a professor, I'm still a PhD student, so it's Mr. Choo. Need to clarify. Yeah, well, hopefully. But anyway, regarding how that has changed, for my very specific small instance, right, of the history of the Singapore Zoo, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but one thing I noticed was that Singaporeans over time have become very educated with animals. The way they imagine animals, it's not just the animals in front of them, it's the animals as far away as the Arctic, the polar bears, the rhinoceroses, the exotic cloud forests of South America. And it's all because, in part, because of the Singapore Zoo and the internet. New sources of information allow Singaporeans, or I think people in general, to imagine how they relate to nature more broadly. But I think what Prof. Barnard said about, we're no longer so connected to the land also applies when I studied the Singapore Zoo, because as the Singapore Zoo developed, Singapore was also developing. A lot of the farmland was shrinking also. So Singaporeans became even more and more urbanized. So the only way in which they would interact with animals often was through the internet or through the zoo. Today, when I go back to Singapore, the only place I might interact with an animal, maybe my pet, but it might be the community cats in my neighborhood estate, the stray cats all around. We don't really get to interact with animals anymore. So I think the way we think of them, the kind of ways in which we would treat them in the past, when I read about the cruelty and the violence, I think people these days are more squeamish about killing the animals or doing things to these animals. So it's a lot more virtual, I would say, or like I feel like animals have migrated into our heads. They're no longer out there because so many of them have gone extinct. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Mr. Barnard and Mr. Choo, for the answers. We have two questions left coming from Zinedine. So the first one is, how has the standardization of zookeepers in Singapore developed over since the colonial times? Because in Indonesia, the zoo management is bad. In big cities like Surabaya and Medan, zoos are bankrupt because the number of visitors are decreasing. And the second question is how to hunt animals and take them to the zoo in the colonial era. I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Prof, I think I'll take the zoo question. I think maybe
you take number one, I'll take number two.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe on the question about the standardization, one thing that was very striking to me was that in the colonial period, a lot of these zoos were small scale. So the sense I get is that people just learn on the go. There wasn't an institution or school to train zookeepers. There weren't best practices and standards that you had to meet. So, if you had the money, you bought an animal, and then if you had more money, you bought more animals, and then you would learn, either they died or you learn how to take care of them well. That's the sense I get. So when you come into the Singapore Zoological Gardens, right, this was when the state comes in, and the state has a lot of money to support the zoo. One thing about zoos is that it's very expensive to feed animals, to make sure they are well. So when it comes to the era of the Singapore Zoological Gardens, exactly like what you said, there is a standardization. There is a way to treat animals in world-class conditions. It becomes almost a narrative, right? We can take care of these animals. And later on in the 1990s, the zoo justifies bringing a polar bear into Singapore because, it can reproduce. it's so comfortable. We have looked after it so well that it even gave birth to a baby in the tropics of Singapore. So to answer your question, the standardization, it has definitely, I think, become more regulated, also because of global standards. We are now more connected than we were through the internet, through these global institutions that have sort of ensured that there are best practices, there are rigorous standards for how to look after animals. But also that also helps animals because the standard of healthcare for these animals have also improved. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, to get an animal for a zoo was both simple and easy. Animals were brought to Singapore, for example, or even to Surabaya and Batavia or Jakarta during the colonial era on normal ships. Every ship that traveled in Southeast Asia had exotic animals on it. So, for example, if the ship was coming from Sulawesi or Maluku, they would often have birds of paradise or beautiful animals on them because the sailors would want to come and sell them. And so they would often bring the animals to Singapore and sell them just as you got off the ship. When you got off the ship, you could buy snakes and birds and orangutans and other things. There were businesses in Singapore whose job was to sell exotic animals during the colonial era. You could go and buy a monkey. You could go and buy whatever you wanted if you had the money. And it was very easy. But because of, orang bule and ego and everything else, a lot of these Westerners would live in Singapore and collect the animals to send not only in Singapore, but to zoos and circuses in America or Europe. But they would make themselves sound like brave men who fought tigers and went into the jungle and captured them. In reality, they just waited in Singapore and bought them when they came off the ship. Now, there were also people who would then capture, let's just say in Sumatra or Malaya or Java, they would capture birds and sell them. It was a market. They would capture tigers and things like this. And then they would transport them. Komodo dragons, for example, people would literally just go to Komodo, capture a dragon, bring it out, take it to Surabaya or Jakarta, and that was fine. Okay. And this was so common. I'll give you one example from Singapore and from Java. In Singapore, we have a bird called the Javan myna, and it is a pest. It is everywhere. You go outside, you go eat outside, and they try to eat your food. They're everywhere. We do not like them in Singapore. They come from Java, where in Java, they are an endangered species. Please take all of ours from Singapore. We don't want them. But they were originally captured in Java and sent to Singapore as a songbird. People would put them in a cage and listen to the sound, and oh, it's pretty. And in the 1930s, they were released to the forest, and they just grew. So in Singapore today, we have too many Javan mynas, where in Java, you don't have any. And that has all occurred during the colonial era. So please come take our Javan mynas and take them back home. We don't mind. But the point is, there was a whole business and economy of capturing wild animals and selling them to cities, Batavia, Surabaya, Singapore, or even ship them to America or Europe. This was very common in big business.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Choo and Mr. Barnard, for the elaboration and the answers. So Due to the time constraint, the previous question marked the end of today's event. And to recap, under the topic of doing animal history in Southeast Asia, we know how beneficial it is to develop the field as it can help us to see issues from other perspective. It can be done through several methods and sources, as mentioned earlier. And here I want to encourage everyone to check more on our speakers' publications to get a better understanding on doing the animal history field, or should you have to do the animal history field. And thank you again, Mr. Barnard and Mr. Choo, for the wonderful presentations. We learned so much today, and I'm really sorry if there were any mispronunciations or for the 13 minutes delay. I'm really sorry for that. There was so much enthusiasm here. And thank you again to all participants for joining us today and for the high enthusiasms. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and gained new insights, and see you next time.
Okay,
Thank you.
terima kasih. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Mr. Barnard. Thank you,
Yeah.
Mr. Chu.
Okay, have a good day. See you. I'm going
Have
to
a good
dinner
day.
now. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. You may leave the room. Bye. See you next time.